Here we begin part 2 of foxes in Tasmania.
98, and they or their progeny were living in the wild. It recommended the use of a DNA test to monitor foxes by looking at fox poo, or what are called scats. In 2005, a single fox scat had been found at Kanara in the Tasmanian Midlands. That scat had fox DNA in it, and a new type of fox hunt was on. One of the advisors to the program, Professor Stephen Sarr from the University of Canberra, had developed a method of testing predator scats for fox DNA. Professor Sarr then used that test to run a survey of scats across Tasmania in predetermined sites.
So what we did in that survey was collect all predator scats that we encountered, but the primary goal of that survey was to detect any evidence of foxes through DNA in the scats. So that was the primary purpose of the original survey.
By late 2012, nearly 10,000 scats had been collected across the state, and 56 was said to be fox positive. In other words, there was fox DNA in them. It seemed conclusive. Based on these fox-positive scats, as well as 4 carcasses and other items, Stephen Sarr published a paper in 2012 saying that foxes were widespread in Tasmania. But the scientific team that's now reviewing the fox program is disputing that as well. Leading that new review is Clive Marks.
What we're interested in defining is the existence of an extant living fox population. So we can't rely upon assumptions or rely upon anecdotal evidence or rely upon the provision of materials from someone else. We need empirical data to make the case. And that's why the scat DNA data was the most convincing, because it was indeed empirical data. And that's why it's quite significant if you look at that data and you find that there is a potential for false positives, but there is also no indication that the data that's been gathered is from a fox population. And there are many indications that it fits an explanation which has more to do with false positives than foxes.
Clive Marks is saying that there's a high probability that these fox-positive scats are mistakes. Criminal cases have shown DNA testing can be flawed. The survey test developed by Stephen Sarr was based on mitochondrial DNA, and in 2007 a paper was published saying this test was accurate and reliable. Clive Marks and his team reran that test using a laboratory in Portugal that specialises in mitochondrial DNA and wildlife surveys.
What the laboratory reported was that there was a great potential for error, or false positives, type 1 error by another name, where the scat DNA assay, or one of them that had been used by the Eradication program, failed to adequately discriminate fox DNA from common prey species, an endemic predator, 2 common species of domestic livestock, for instance.
In other words, the mitochondrial DNA test used initially to detect fox scats could also identify rabbits and even cattle as foxes. The pattern of the scats across Tasmania also raised eyebrows. One scat was found alone on an island 3 kilometres offshore. One of the new papers challenging that DNA test has only just appeared online, and I caught up with Stephen Sarr again when he had a chance to read it. He was on a mobile phone in the Tasmanian Midlands on a new scat survey.
Yeah, I don't think it's disputing it. What it's saying is that if you apply a PCR amplification to tissue, there's a risk that you'll amplify DNA from non-target species. Well, that's not new. We've known that always. And I think the important thing is that we run a sequential test.
We're talking about a test in 2 stages here. The first is looking at the mitochondrial DNA to see if it looks like a fox. The second step is the more specific DNA sequencing test to show that it is fox DNA. However, both those tests together still have the potential for false positives. In other words, there's the potential to mistake something else for the scat of a wild fox. Stephen Saar says the likelihood of false positives is extremely low. As few as 4 in 1,000 scats tested might be a false positive. Remember, nearly 10,000 scats were collected and 56 show Fox DNA. Stephen Saar.
It's 0.4 of 1%, so 4 in 1,000, could by chance be false.
Well, if you've got 10,000, that's 40 scats. That's getting up towards your range of Fox-positive scats confirmed with sequencing, isn't it?
Yeah, that would be true, except that we think the number's probably a lot lower than 4 in 1,000.
But the 56 Fox-positive scats in your test would come within the range of false positives.
Well, it's right at the upper end, yeah. So there is a possibility that any of those scats are false positives, but more testing is needed to get a really precise idea of that.
But you'd have to think that potentially all those 56 scats, they fall within that range. They could be false positives.
Now, there's a possibility of that. On the basis of the evidence we have so far, I think that's very unlikely.
It was also the distribution of Fox-positive scats that concerned Clive Marks. One was found on Bruny Island off the Tasmanian coast. The distribution of scats doesn't match what you'd expect to find from living foxes. Foxes poo 6 to 8 times a day and mark their territories with their scats. When vixens breed, they stay near dens for months. If you had a living and breeding fox population, you'd expect to find scats in clusters, not singly, scattered randomly about the state, many kilometres apart over many years. Clive Marks says the random distribution of fox-positive scats is also an indicator of false positives.
And this isn't an opinion, this is based upon empirical analysis. There's no doubt at all that these data fit false positives better than they fit the existence of a fox population.
The complicating thing about this explanation is that if the scats don't match fox behaviour and yet do have fox DNA in them, how did the fox DNA get there? Since 2005, the Fox Eradication program has imported more than 1,000 fox scats to train their sniffer dogs and for other research. We're talking about DNA tests here that are highly sensitive. Minuscule amounts of fox DNA can be passed from hand to scat to hand again. Hygiene's crucial, especially when the teams handling scats for research and training are the same teams looking for wild foxes. At least 2 scats that tested as fox positive in the survey, in other words, they were sequenced and found to have fox DNA in them, were later removed from the survey. Stephen Saar.
I think there were 2, but there was some doubt over the origin of the scats, and they were excluded.
What do you mean origin?
Some doubt from the department who decided that they felt there was some doubt about the origin of the scats. Well, that's something you'd have to talk to the department about. I don't know, to be honest.
We've tried for more than a month to speak to someone from the Fox Eradication program that's now part of the invasive species branch of the Tasmanian government. We've been told no one's available. Contamination is always a risk in DNA testing. Fox carcasses and skins have in the past been routinely brought into the state. The Fox Eradication program had stuffed foxes in its offices. Background Briefing spoke to a former field worker with the Fox program who wanted to remain anonymous, but he described his concerns about contamination.
The office was festooned with fox pelts, fox bones, stuffed foxes, and it would seem to me if you had fox material in an office and the people who were responsible for collecting that alleged fox scat were moving from that office full of fox parts to collect fox scat, that there must be some potential for contamination there.
Back in Canberra, I asked Stephen Saar how confident he was that scats hadn't been contaminated. After all, fewer than 6 scats in 1,000 were showing fox DNA.
I think the collection methods have been really well defined and well executed as far as I can see.
But here's that former member of the Fox team describing what happened during one research project.
One of the people I was working with pulled the scat apart, withdrew a little microchip sensor like the size of a grain of rice, and swallowed it and thought it was quite comical and pretty funny. I tried to explain that this would have implications for an expensive scientific research program, and it probably threw the whole study out.
There's also a question about the reliability of the 4 fox carcasses and the skull, for instance, used as evidence of living foxes in Tasmania. They were included, along with the scats, in Stephen Sarr's scientific paper that said foxes were widespread. Based on the subsequent review, I suggested to Stephen Sarr that the carcasses and skull weren't really good evidence.
I guess I beg to differ. There is some strong roadkill evidence there. I'm not sure exactly what the point of revisiting that in the sense of, was there a hoax at some point?
Well, as part of your paper, you presented the scats plus the 9 other pieces of physical evidence. And the quality of the evidence does matter. Did you see the evidence, though?
There's doubt on every piece of evidence. I mean, most of it we cannot put a probability on what the doubt is around it.
The problem with the carcasses and the skull is that they were all reported by members of the public and were all moved before they were examined. The stories about where they came from changed. Muddying the issue is a tradition of hoaxing in Tasmania. As we heard, a team of scientists has just reviewed the evidence and rated most of it unreliable. They're publishing their findings in the Wildlife Society Bulletin, and there's a link on the Background Briefing website. A co-author of that paper is veterinary pathologist Dr. David Obendorf.
All that information has been shown to have very questionable authenticity, and the provenance of those carcasses is the problem, that nobody can actually demonstrate that there is any linkage of those animals to the landscape in which they've been found.
But they were found in Tasmania. How did they get here?
Well, how do they get here is the big problem. That we know that the borders are flaky, that people can bring things in. The difficulty that the government had in 2009-10 was that there was clear evidence that people were bringing in carcasses or fox products like green pelts that were being requested to be tanned, or whole carcasses that were being asked to be taxidermied by freeze-drying, and these animals were going through, passing the border barrier quarantine and coming to Tasmania.
The Fox Eradication Program's former biologist, Nick Mooney, is angry that people use this to doubt the existence of foxes in Tasmania.
A lot of people just glibly dismiss stuff that doesn't suit their frame of mind.
You'd silence any critics, wouldn't you, if you could prove that a dead fox beside the road was...
No, how would you prove it?
Well,
there would be people who would just say we planted it there.
There might be scats nearby.
Well, people would just say you planted them there.
So you think people are that cynical?
Absolutely. We've got plenty of stuff like that from some of the people you've interviewed that just keep moving the goalpost. And if you take the conspiracy card and say, well, that might be the case, except you guys planted it anyway, which is what's often been accused, well, that's incredibly lazy thinking, and it means you can win any argument. You just say people made it up, and I'm afraid there's an awful lot of that in Tasmania.
I get the feeling that they are operating in good faith. They're not being cynical for the sake of it.
I don't share that entirely.
Why is that?
I think there's an element of scuttlebutt here, and some people enjoy the intellectual warfare, let's put it like that.
The intellectual warfare is all about the evidence. Most people associated with the Fox program say even if you dismiss the evidence, it's not been worth taking any risk. So destructive would foxes be to Tasmanian wildlife. Here's Peter McGlone from the Tasmanian Conservation Trust.
And so a lot of people can't seem to ask the question, well, should we wait until there's a lot of foxes and then try and eradicate them? They never seem to want to ask that question, and if they did, they'd obviously say, of course we don't want to wait till there's a lot of foxes and then try and eradicate them. We should try and eradicate them early on when there's few of them. And if there's few of them in a big landmass that's ideal for foxes, it's going to be hard to cite them. It's going to be even harder to find physical evidence.
When the baiting program began more than a decade ago, it was believed foxes had been released around the state. With that story now discredited and major question marks over the other evidence of foxes, Clive Marks says there's no need to keep using the precautionary principle.
The trigger for the precautionary principle requires that there is a cogent argument or there is evidence to suggest that the problem exists. when you use anecdotal information, when you use information which is not empirical data, you risk triggering the precautionary principle for no good reason. There must be a scientific or evidence-based reason to trigger the precautionary principle, and this is one of the major lessons from the program.
No physical evidence at all for foxes has turned up since 2011. Without a live fox to show for a decade-long eradication program, the existence of foxes in Tasmania has become theoretical, even to the people associated with the program. I asked the former spokesman of the Fox Eradication Program, Nick Mooney, if he was worried about a backlash over the amount of money spent.
There's the potential for that sort of criticism or image for some people, and a whole lot of other people, though, I suggest would say, good on you for not taking a risk. Because a lot of people would understand that by the time you had enough evidence to satisfy everyone, it would be too late to do anything, and you can't wait that long. In the end, in 20 years or 30 years or whatever, people will ask, did you get rid of foxes? They won't ask how much you spent.
Background Briefing sought a response from the Tasmanian government about the millions of dollars spent on the fox eradication program for no result. The Minister for Primary Industries, Jeremy Rockliff, declined to be interviewed, but his office released a statement saying that the new Liberal government is concerned about how much money was spent on fox eradication at the expense of other threats. The government's just announced a new biosecurity division to look more widely at a range of threats and to protect Tasmania's pest-free reputation. Veterinary pathologist David Obendorf agrees about Tasmania's reputation, but says it's a different kind of reputation that's already been damaged.
It's really not doing justice to Tasmania's ability to take charge of an issue which is really important, and particularly if they're getting Commonwealth funding on the back of it, that there should have been very, very rigorous oversight. And I think we've inherited a problem out of a failure of due diligence.
Background Briefing's coordinating producer is Linda McGuinness. Research by Anna Whitfeld. Technical production by Russell Stapleton. The executive producer is Chris Bullock, and I'm Ian Townsend.
Okay. Right. So what they said in that, essentially, although they said it slightly better in the science report a couple of days ago, what they said is that one fox once was seen to get off a boat here in Burnie in Tasmania. And that fox is apparently got onto a boat at the port of Melbourne, and the boat has sailed across Bass Strait to Burnie. And apparently, the gist of what I got on the science report, science show, is that there's lots of foxes around Melbourne. There are foxes in the city of Melbourne. There are suburban foxes, urban foxes, city foxes. They get around. A friend of mine in Cornwall went to London and met a fox in the backyard of a house in London. So foxes get around. There are city foxes in Europe. There are foxes on mainland Australia live in the city too. And multiple eyewitnesses saw the one get off the boat at Burnie in Tasmania. Just playing with the tripod there. But the story is that when a fox in Melbourne stows away on a boat, say a deck cargo or something like that, probably chasing rats or mice in the middle of the night, the fox may get off in Burnie in Tasmania and disappear into the Tasmanian wilderness. Or it may continue to live around the streets of Burnie because it's an urban fox. But it doesn't ever get to meet a mate. And the one that was observed, it was not in fox breeding season. So it wasn't actually a pregnant vixen. And when they get across Bass Strait, they basically die out. It's a little bit like the loch in Scotland, where there's an island with a colony of wallabies. Some nutter 120, 150 years ago decided they wanted a colony of wallabies on the island in their loch in Scotland, and every now and then a freedom-minded wallaby decides to make a break for it and swim back to Australia, and it actually crosses the loch. Trouble is, there's a motorway on the other side of the paddock that the loch is in. So the wallabies that actually reach the shore start hopping around, and they've got no more road sense in Scotland than they have in Australia. So they get hit by a car on the motorway and killed. It's the only place in England or in Britain where you can run a risk of roadkill from a wallaby. Well, that's what happens to the foxes that hitchhike across Bass Strait. They never live to breed. They don't go anywhere. They don't do much. And whether anybody did at any stage actually import 12.5 wild foxes captured in New South Wales or somewhere and let them go at 16 different locations in Tasmania, I mean, who would do that, and what would be the point? If you maroon 16 foxes out of touch with each other, they're not going to establish a breeding colony for the hunters to shoot at. On the other hand, it's a fairly well-known phenomenon that the people who like to hunt feral pigs make sure that no area is ever completely cleaned out of feral pigs. There's a story that people who like mustering brumbies that run wild in the national parks tend to introduce high-priced bloodstock to the brumby herd to improve the bloodlines. So the people who work in the National Parks and Wildlife Service, they're kind of pre-primed to have biases towards the idea that hunters are wicked, evil people who like to introduce feral animals into the pristine wilderness, and they like shooting foxes, therefore they will introduce foxes to Tasmania. Because like in New South Wales, I know people who, when I was in high school, their father gave them a gun for their 16th birthday, and they shot foxes and sold the skins in order to get their first car. There is an industry devoted to shooting feral foxes. So, my honest opinion on the great Tasmanian fox eradication paradox is that you've got confirmation bias from both sides. And both sides think they're right, and both sides feel quite noble about their attitudes, and neither side's going to do much about backing down unless and until somebody on the skeptic side happens to stumble across a vixen and a den of cubs somewhere in the middle of Tasmania. And by the time that happens, it will be too late. So they're going to have to run a bit of a surveillance program, whether there are foxes in Tasmania or not, just to make sure that there are no foxes in Tasmania. It would be empirical common sense to keep an eye out for something that's going to be virtually impossible to eradicate if you allow it to grow to be a really big problem. So that's my take on the Tasmanian fox eradication paradox. Ciao.